It's the Attack of the Clones as Intellivision Archive closes out 1981. Last episode, we went through the first of 6 games released in 1981 for the Intellivision, and now we're hitting the other 3. As I mentioned last time, these represent the first tranche of releases developed internally by Mattel Electronics, but that doesn't mean Mattel had moved all development in-house. Our first game this video, Space Armada, was another game developed at external studio APH, which had developed all Intellivision software prior to this year. As one could probably guess from seeing the game in action for more than 3 seconds, Space Armada is a clone of Taito's monster hit arcade game, Space Invaders. I delved into the history of that game in my Atari Archive episode on the VCS port, and I encourage you to check that out if you want more details. But in short, that arcade game, designed by Tomohiro Nishikado and released in the summer of 1978, was wildly successful in its home country, with machines popping up basically at any venue that could reasonably support it. By the end of the Invader boom in June 1979, somewhere in the range of 280,000 copies of Space Invaders and its various clones, both licensed and unofficial, existed in Japan. A mind-boggling number, given that the most successful arcade game in the much larger United States market, Pac-Man, sold around 100,000 units here. Space Invaders also did incredibly well in the US too, though, with approximately 65,000 units sold by Midway. Given the immense success of the arcade game and the explosive breakout sales of Atari's home port in March 1980, it's unsurprising that this was an early priority for Mattel as the company moved beyond its initial creations. Developed by Caltech summer hire Chris Hawley and John Brooks, Space Armada takes advantage of the fact that Space Invaders hadn't been properly protected in copyright. As long as the name was changed, one could readily clone it. This is, of course, not a straight port of the arcade game. The number of defensive bunkers has been reduced from 4 to 3, and due to resolution differences and hardware constraints, the 55 invaders of the arcade game have been reduced to 32 here, in 8 columns and 4 rows. It's worth noting that the Intellivision hardware is only capable of moving 8 objects on screen at a given time. And unlike the Atari VCS's line-by-line screen creation, you can't necessarily cheat it to slap a bunch more sprites on screen than normal. But Hawley and Brooks did just that by using GRAM sequencing, which allowed them to animate background graphics in such a way to create the effect of more than 8 enemies. Technically speaking, when the Intellivision draws the background, the stick graphics processor grabs a graphics card from GRAM as identified by the background table. By changing the card being grabbed to a different one or by changing it between frames, the card will be animated. Many games going forward use this to animate various background elements, particularly the more action-oriented titles that were rapidly growing in popularity for home console. Space Armada has a few other notable changes from Space Invaders to keep things interesting and more home-friendly. For starters, the game starts you with 6 lives, with a new one earned after each wave completed. The arcade game notably changed very little between waves other than starting the invaders 1 row lower to the ground, but here the aliens instead gain some marching speed and perform attack changes as you move deeper into the game. Starting off with basic zigzagging lasers, the Armada begins firing bombs starting in the 3rd wave that explode on impact, a guided missile in the 7th wave that moves towards your gun after being fired, and finally an energy shuriken that they begin firing in the 11th wave, which fly directly towards your base at high speed. So fast that the only way to really avoid them is to lure them into your defensive bunkers. Starting in the 5th wave, aliens will also begin appearing as cloaked, invisible foes, culminating in the 9th wave when all 32 of them can only be seen at random times when they show themselves. Another change to the game mechanics is related to the bunkers and mystery ships. In the arcade game, your bunkers would be restored after each wave, at least until the invaders start so low that they're eradicated immediately. Because the Armada in this game never starts at a lower altitude or destroys the bunkers while walking over them, this doesn't come up. But instead, your bunkers are not restored between rounds. To do so, you need to shoot the mystery ships themselves. And while the point value on the arcade original was ostensibly random, it was based on your shot count, so a good player could reliably get the 300-point maximum every time a ship emerged. On the Intellivision, that UFO's score is truly randomized between 1 and 32 points, multiplied by another factor, the wave you're on, and the subsequent point value of the aliens. At the baseline, the aliens are worth 10 points each, but that number is multiplied by the wave you are on. As such, for example, shooting the saucer in the 5th wave could net you 1,500 points or more. But shooting the saucer is also the only way to restore your bunkers. Every time you successfully blast a UFO out of the sky, the most damaged bunker is repaired, and if the bunkers have been destroyed completely, the game will prioritize their restoration from the left, then right, and then center units. Furthermore, the UFOs will begin to get aggressive themselves starting on the 13th wave, diving through the Armada to personally destroy your bunkers or crash into your gun. Space Armada accordingly goes beyond being a mere Invaders clone in pretty short order in ways that make sense for a home release that you're going to be playing presumably a lot more often than an arcade machine. It also helpfully adds a practice mode that you can enter when you've lost the game so that you can practice the screen you just lost on repeatedly at a slightly slower speed, giving you the opportunity to refine your skills. In all, this is a feature-rich package on par in different ways with what Rick Moore included on his VCS Space Invaders cartridge and its 112 game variations. The biggest ding against it is that you can't start with any of these twists on the basic Invaders formula akin to the VCS cart, but instead, you just have to play your way to them. Between these changes and the chunkiness of the playfield, Space Armada is a decidedly faster-paced game than other Invader clones, forcing a degree of aggression unlike that seen in the arcade game's deliberate shot-counting pace, or other home attempts such as Magnavox's Alien Invaders Plus, which requires a more defensive approach, or even Atari's Space Invaders, which falls somewhere in between the arcade game and Armada. On the whole, this game is a great time for people pining for their shooter fix on a platform that really had very little other than Astrosmash in that department. It may not match its fellow Intellivision release as a unique experience, but it takes its own cues on how to approach the console action game that not only work very well, but also don't lead a good session to last over an hour. Space Armada joined Astrosmash and Space Battle in Mattel's new ad campaign taking fire at Atari's dominance in the popular space game genre, and evidently both the theming and the ad campaign paid off. While Space Armada sold about 153,300 units in the first few weeks it was on the market in 1981, sales shot up in 1982 by another 750K, with around 2,000 in returns in May of 1983. An internal Mattel memo from November of that year listed its total sales to stores at about 931,100 units through June. This puts it in comparable territory to Mattel's other space games and its highest-selling sports titles like NFL football. This is also a game that can be found in both the original Action Network box branding and the subsequent Space Network, the latter being significantly more common to find today. Yet despite these sales figures, it's difficult to find contemporary coverage of Space Armada, coming out as it did before the boom in games media in 1982. Joystick gave it pretty average scores across the board in its December 1982 buying guide, considering it below Mattel's usual standards, and with a cramped playing area with, they concede, colorful graphics. Evidently, they did not make it very far into the game, as the only alternate shot they mention is the explosive one that begins appearing in the third wave. The UK magazine TV Gamer also gave it a lackluster review, writing that the controls with the disc weren't great and the invaders were slow and chunky. On the brighter side, Video Games devoted a short section in a feature covering the Intellivision and the Bally Professional Arcade that compared Space Armada to the arcade's own Astro Battle, known briefly as Space Invaders in its own right. They note that while Bally's take is reasonably true to the original, Mattel put a lot of twists into Space Armada, listing off several of the wrinkles the game throws at you. They conclude that it may be hard to say whether or not it's a more interesting game than Atari or Bally's own Invader titles, but that it regardless lives up to the Mattel standard for making games more strategically complex and variable. While maybe not the top of anyone's list of Intellivision favorites, there's a lot to really enjoy about Space Armada. It may give a first impression of being a chunky, mediocre Space Invaders ripoff, but the later stages really give it an identity all of its own. Our second game this video, Triple Action, was also produced at APH. Programmed and designed by Rich O'Keefe, and originally known internally at that company as Some of Theirs, this title is essentially a compilation of games inspired by the Atari VCS library. Accordingly, there are 3 distinct modes to play: battle tanks, car racing, and biplanes. As you may surmise from playing or seeing these in action, their inspirations include Atari's tank arcade game that, in turn, was the basis for Combat, a racing game akin to Atari's Street Racer or perhaps Taito's Speed Race, and an air combat game superficially similar to the biplane game on Combat, but with more in common with the Channel F game Spitfire or Fun Game's 1974 arcade title, Biplane. Yet Mattel's original ambitions for this cartridge were that it would be known as the 5-in-1 arcade, with 2 additional games on board. a Pong-like hockey game, and a Breakout-inspired clone called Brickout. According to the Blue Sky Rangers website, not long before 5-in-1's completion, Mattel's lawyers stepped in and noted that it was perhaps too much like Atari's offerings, so Hockey and Brickout were purged from the final release. Brickout made its way onto later Intellivision Lives game compilations, and is a fascinating take on the block breaker in its own right, with walls of bricks slowly descending down the screen. By all accounts, Brickout was quite popular among the Intellivision programmers, hence why the binary continued to float around the office. Triple Action's final lineup may be derivative, but they're all excellent takes on their respective games. Battle Tanks features some snappy movement and action, and it makes for a fairly different experience than Mattel's more strategic launch game Armor Battle. Game options include how far your shells go before no longer being a threat, and whether or not you have to contend with bouncing shots akin to Combat's Tank Pong game types. After a tank is destroyed, both reset back to their respective corners of the maze to begin again. This includes accidentally destroying yourself, as the bouncing shells are just as deadly to their originator as they are to their prospective target. Trees dot the landscape as well, but don't serve any actual purpose beyond graphical detail. The first player to reach 15 points wins the match. All in all, it's a serviceable version of Tank, if several years late given that the original was a 1974 arcade title and the Atari VCS port was a 1977 launch game. Car Race sees both players competing to see who can drive 100 miles first on a straightaway road. The game options let you choose how heavy the traffic is that you need to maneuver around, and crashing into another vehicle costs you some time as your car is stunned and must get back up to speed. Here the side buttons control your accelerator and your brake, though the latter is certainly not instantaneous. It's actually a fascinating little game. Cars in the left lane will be heading down the screen, making it incredibly risky to pass someone on the right due to how little time you may have to react. While you could in theory drive right down the middle, some cars will drift left and right in their respective lane as though they're drunk or distracted, while others will hug one or the other side of a lane. Odds are good that you'll probably crash a few times when traffic gets heavy unless you're smart with your brakes, which it is worthwhile to be since you'll lose less time than if you crash. It's not a terribly compelling or deep game, but Car Race is about as good as you could really get out of this kind of driving experience. Without question, the game that makes this package worthwhile, its crown jewel, is Biplanes. Here we have a dog-fighting game where each player must take off from the ground and try to shoot down their opponent. You have the option for how much range your bullets will travel, but other than that, the game is deceptively simple. The lower action button starts your engine, and you'll use the disc to fly up or down. The upper side buttons fire your guns. Like Battle Tanks, you're aiming to be the first to 15 points, which you can earn either by shooting your opponent or by taking out the observation balloon that begins floating up from a center platform after a while. But your flight controls are really what sets this apart from its competitors' offerings. Biplanes features a fairly sophisticated understanding of plane operations for a basic dogfighting game. Climbing will lose you speed, and if you go straight up for too long, you'll stall out and crash. Conversely, diving builds you an immense amount of speed that you can use to bring down on your opponent before zooming back up. Coupled with the cloud cover you can hide behind once you get high enough, you have a game with enough strategic depth to stay interesting for a long time. And Biplanes was immensely popular within Mattel. The Blue Sky Rangers site reports that more time was spent playing Biplanes internally than any other Intellivision title, to the point where, when an April Fool's Day memo was circulated insisting that Biplanes be deleted from programmers' hard disk, at least one person, Steve Montero, figured it was real and did so. In fact, on August 6, 1982, the programmers even held the Great Biplanes Tournament, with undisputed masters of the game Montero and Russ Haft going head-to-head in a best-of-7 with Keith Robinson and Mark Urbaniak on commentary during Montero's last day with the company. It may not be esports, but an edited video was posted on YouTube way back in 2007. There aren't a lot of reviews out there for Triple Action either, but Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz did write one in March 1982 within Video Magazine. While they remarked that it was odd for Mattel to publish a second tank game after Armor Battle, Battle Tanks was nonetheless a legitimate effort that differentiated itself through arcade action. The other two game modes got short shrift, with them remarking that Car Race was nothing special, but Biplanes was delightful. The pair did end up awarding Triple Action a Best Video Game Audio-Visual Effects Certificate of Merit in the Archie Awards published in January 1983, noting that the developers took a played-out idea and gave it fresh life with delightful visual treatment, this time singling out Biplanes as an absolute joy in particular. TV Gamer also gave it a brief review, referring to it as a generally above average compilation, where the biplane game in particular stands out. Triple Action was a moderately successful seller for Mattel despite only getting 42,000 units out to stores in 1981. By the end of June 1983, the game had sold 503,400 units, down 1,000 from May. Very middle of the road for Intellivision game sales overall. Its arcadey nature makes this immediately approachable in a way that a lot more sophisticated Intellivision games are not, however. And if nothing else, it's worth checking out for biplanes. Our final game, Snafu, is Mattel's take on another heavily cloned arcade title, Gremlin's 1976 release Blockade. The idea there is that your character leaves a trail behind them, and you want to force your opponent to crash into that wall before you crash yourself, as the rapidly filling screen leaves you less and less room to work with. Gremlin's game led to a rush of 3,000 orders upon its debut, which the company struggled to fulfill, allowing numerous coin-op clones space to thrive, at least to the extent that the game allowed. Blockade and its clones weren't hugely popular with players. Arcades weren't the only venue for clones, though, as home versions such as Atari Surround and Bally's Checkmate also showed up as those programmable consoles made their respective debuts. Developed internally at Mattel by Mike Minkoff, Snafu certainly is a striking take on that style of game, if some years late to the craze. But there is a bit more to it than you'd initially expect. In an interview recorded for the Intellivision Lives game collection released back in 1998, Minkoff remarked that this was his favorite game that he worked on at Mattel, having also co-developed PBA Bowling and working on the IntelliVoice game Space Spartans before being promoted to management. Yet the one thing he said he wished he could have changed was nothing about the game itself but the name. His original name was Snakes, even using it on the title screen and pushing for it to be released under that title. Yet marketing opted for Snafu, which is an acronym used in the military for situation normal, all fouled up. As Minkoff put it, this name had nothing to do with the game compared to his own. In contrast to the more traditional clone of Gremlin's arcade original, there are two distinctive game modes here. The first are trap game types, which follow the traditional Blockade rules. The Blue Sky Rangers website suggests that a different Blockade, the board game from 1975, inspired this game mode, but the two really don't have that much in common, so the linkage to the arcade game seems likelier. Depending on your selection, you'll get to play with either 2 or 4 trails, though obviously no more than 2 trail makers can be humans in a given match. Other choices include gaining the option to move diagonally, deciding whether or not trails disappear or remain once the respective player is eliminated, and whether or not there are obstacles already on the field. Whenever a player loses, all the other participants in the round gain a point. The number of rounds is set at the beginning of the game, and at the end, the winner is whoever has the most points. One neat touch is that whenever a round comes down to 2 players, a cute little tune begins playing to raise the tension. The second mode includes bite game types. These were inspired by an unreleased Mattel Electronics handheld LED game, and essentially involve trying to bite off the tail of your opponent's snake until there's nothing left. All of these are 2-player exclusive game modes, and they do provide a nice change of pace from the traditional Blockade experience. The only options involved here are whether or not you can move diagonally, and if there are obstacles in play to get around. In some ways, these bite games are reminiscent of the 1982 Odyssey 2 release Casey's Crazy Chase, where you need to do essentially the same thing to the tail of the Dratapillar, but doing so in a 2-player contest is pretty different. Technically speaking, Snafu does use a technique available to the Intellivision known as Colored Squares mode, and is the only released game to do so. The Intellivision breaks up its background tiles into 8x8 cards, and typically using a foreground-background coloring method, those can only be 2 colors apiece. Colored Squares mode allows 4 primary colors per card, but these are limited literally to squares, which means that the entire background consists of 4x4 cards. Since Snafu is pretty much all squares, this allowed for a game that was more colorful than most Intellivision titles could really wind up being. Only 2 other games at the time used this mode, the unreleased and aforementioned Brickout, and Takeover, essentially an Intellivision take on the board game Risk, that marketing felt looked a bit too boring to be a strong seller, despite being pretty good. It's hard to say much about Snafu's trap modes, as they're essentially the same sort of Blockade game seen elsewhere. Even the 4-player action isn't terribly unique, given that the Bally Professional Arcade shipped with a 4-player Blockade game built in. At the same time, the Bally Arcade was not a popular piece of hardware the way the Intellivision was, and the inclusion of obstacles does give this an interesting wrinkle. The bite games are more interesting and unique. While I'm not sure they're compelling enough to sell Snafu on their own, if you do own the game already, they do make for a worthwhile play. Minkoff's soundscapes also set this apart from most of its contemporary Blockade clones. The ambient sound effects give way to a couple of charming little tunes that play whenever a match is down to 2 players, and the soundtrack is a bit of an earworm. Charming is a good way to sum up Snafu. The concept was and is a bit old, but the package is so well implemented that it's still something of an early classic for the system. That said, the appeal of such an old concept seemed to have impacted its sales, as internal records indicate the game only sold 378,100 copies through June 1983, 55,100 of which went out in 1981. This puts it above the niche board game translations, educational games, and minor sports titles like Word Fun, NHL Hockey, or Backgammon, but it's certainly on the low end of Mattel's more action and arcade-oriented fare. Snafu did review fairly positively despite its mediocre sales record. TV Gamer considered it superior to Atari's Surround across the board and dubbed it a great family game, while Electronic Games gave it a full write-up in the review section of its second issue. There, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz consider it the most ornate treatment of the subject matter published thus far, writing that while the controller can be a bit of an issue, it brings an abstract strategy game to the platform that had previously been missing, with a surprising number of options. They single out the bite game mode in particular as the biggest attraction to the cart, which probably would have pleased the folks who designed that unreleased handheld game those were based on. Snafu did also wind up on Mattel's short-lived Aquarius home computer, where the hardware's strict graphical limitations didn't impact it too badly. Snafu's translation honestly appears to be one of the stronger ones, as you can still have the tunes, the game modes, and the obstacles. Not that anyone was particularly clamoring for an Aquarius at the time, but those unfortunate folks who picked one up as their computer of choice at least had a good time to be had here. And with these 3 games, we've wrapped up 1981 and the Intellivision timeline. It's strange to consider a system with such a massive release schedule in 1980 only bringing 6 new cartridges to market in its second full year. But all of them are remarkably solid titles that fill in some of the console's weak points, bringing with them more arcade-style action and a few more sports. 1982 will be a significantly busier year for releases, and certainly Mattel was not sitting on its laurels beyond these carts for 1981, points I'll touch on in the next video. But 1981 proved that the system wasn't a fluke and had some serious legs behind it, with nearly 680,000 console units sold and collectively more than 1 million carts. The Intellivision is just getting started. Next time, the total destruction of a planet.